Do you ever get tired of watching BN diesels and Milwaukee switching operations in the 1970s? I know I don't. This is Burr Stewart, and welcome to part 54 of my continuing operations video series. I hope you've enjoyed my previous videos, and today we have a special treat with some prototype footage in addition to our normal HO scale filming. So let's get right on it. As a model railroader, do you ever find yourself rushing to your train layout to copy a train that you saw on the prototype? Well, that's what happened to us today. Charlie Conway was out photographing trains. This is the year 2023, and he saw a real Burlington Northern Santa Fe consist with 3 BN green painted locomotives, even though it's 25 years after the merger. So he brought back the video footage to prove that this had really happened, and we happened to have the right locomotives on hand to put together an HO model of that same train here. The prototype train was 2 SD60Ms bracketing a GP40. So we got out a bunch of modern era cars from storage. Don't ask me why we have those handy in storage, but we hitched them up to this new consist and we drove it around the railroad. Fasten your seatbelts. Here we're heading northbound from Portland and Tacoma, past the Argo yard in South Seattle. Crossing Royal Brome with the appropriate amount of horn, and entering the Stacy Street yard, which was a major place that the Burlington Northern handled all the Seattle industrial traffic at the time. On the left of the train you see a short engine track that we use for storing switchers. And on the right is the Argo yard, where you see a Milwaukee switcher, which will get a lot of attention later in this video. The Argo yard to our right was the interchange point for both the Union Pacific and the Milwaukee during the era that the Milwaukee still had its western extension going. Now, this is a little bit of an anomaly because the Milwaukee would have not lasted past 1980 here in Seattle, whereas this is a modern train, as we saw. We can just forgive this. Reality model railroading is what you do on a real model railroad, and sometimes you're just forced to run a train out of era. This is just one of those times. So I hope you enjoy it, even though I'm violating all my normal principles. So here we're passing right through the middle of Stacy Street Yard on the main line, and you can see the yardmaster's been keeping it pretty clean.
I'll be wrong with that if you see it, but I stuck a piece of wood about 2 feet long.
The engines are entering the tunnel underneath downtown Seattle. There's a hanging on the wall representing the King Street station, which I don't really have room to model on this layout. But that's okay.
I need to figure out.
Nice rotating beacon on that switch engine in the yard. When the train comes out of the tunnel underneath downtown Seattle, it goes along a congested urban area with 4 grade crossings. I have 3 of them modeled here on the layout. And one of these days we'll get some grade crossing bells and flashers installed so that there's a ruckus whenever you come through here. For now, the only ruckus is the horn honking, which you hear in the background. It's nice to see some modern era cars occasionally. If the BNSF railroad can run a prototype consist like we saw earlier the BN green paint. 25 years after the BNSF merger, I don't know why we can't run modern equipment on this railroad, even though we claim to be modeling 1973. That's the Dravis Street overpass in between Queen Anne and Magnolia neighborhoods in Seattle. Next up, the train will go across the Salmon Bay Bridge, number 4, and head past Golden Gardens and Carkeek Park. Well, that's a cool shot. But you know you really want to watch the prototype some more, so let's do that for a few minutes. Looks like it was a windy day on the Columbia River, and Charlie Conway was out there with a couple of friends, and they just could not believe their eyes when they saw this train with 3 XBN green locomotives still wearing their green paint. Amazing. That's a hard shot to get on a model railroad.
Why don't you creep ahead slowly?
Somebody didn't get the memo on setting all of the CVs for a top speed of 30 miles an hour. This looks like more like 60 miles an hour or something. Outstanding. Nice weathering job on those trucks too, huh? Whew, that was intense. In the meantime, while some construction's going on in the background, more on that later, the Milwaukee switcher is busy working Argo Yard and trying to get ready to bring a bunch of cars over to Stacy Street to the Burlington Northern interchange. At the helm we have engineer Scott, and as you'll see, he's doing a very professional job at running this switch engine. Pay no attention to that vacuum cleaner in the background. I don't know why the lights in the cab are on the entire time, but that's probably a setting in the decoder that I need to fix. And you can see he's got a crew member out there on the handrails. Anyway, Scott is in the process of classifying the cars in the Milwaukee part of the Argo Yard in South Seattle. And when he gets them all sorted out, he's going to bring them over to the BN in interchange, and then he'll run empty back with his switcher. Now, that seems a little strange, but as you probably know, when railroads interchange cars with other railroads, in general, and there were always exceptions to this, but in general, they would haul the cars over to the railroad that they were delivering them to in interchange, and they would then return empty because of various work rules. The other railroad would bring its interchange cars over using its own switch crew.
You're laughing.
That way you could say there's twice as much work to do the same job, which is bringing one set of cars over from Railroad A to Railroad B and the other one back from Railroad B to Railroad A. Now for the model railroaders, this is a great boon because we have twice as much work to do with the same railroad layout. Nice. So getting back to the switching action here, as you see, Scott is what we call drilling this Argo yard. He's shoving cars back and forth until he gets them sorted. He's got to keep some of the Milwaukee cars on the Milwaukee because the Milwaukee in Seattle in 1973 had quite a bit of business. They ran the car barge ferry over to Port Townsend, leading to some large plywood and paper mills in Port Angeles, Washington. And they ran a train all the way up to Bellingham, where there were some additional paper mills and different sort of customers. So the Milwaukee switcher on this railroad is quite busy, even though the main focus of our model railroad is the Burlington Northern. The Milwaukee is a very nice side job. And you'll notice that Scott's got his car cards and waybills all over the layout on what we call the Colorado main. And that's largely because there isn't anyone else working the railroad this afternoon, and so he has the luxury of being able to just use the railroad as a table. This is, of course, frowned upon if you're in a real operating session with lots of operators. But it is convenient, so I'm letting him do it.
I had to wear the glasses because it was on my certificate. And we waited 2 weeks to be able to do the flight because the weather was so bad.
You may notice some clicks in the background. Scott is using a ProtoThrottle to control this locomotive, and so he's constantly flipping the reversing lever, the brake lever, and of course the throttle. Like I say, you'll hear these clicks quite frequently as he sets the brake or accelerates. Hear those clicks in the background? Very nice. Another thing I wanted to point out here is you notice we haven't ballasted the Argo yard tracks yet. You can really see the difference on the right-hand side of ballasted mainline tracks. It's a double track there. And then on the left, of course, you have all these, in this case, 5 tracks of the Argo yard. And we haven't put the ballast there, so they just look plain. Now, what I did was to put down some ground cover before I laid this track so that it looks a little better than just bare plywood. But we'll get around to ballasting it one day, and then you'll look back and say, oh, I remember watching this layout before they even ballasted Argo. All right, well, he got those cars straightened out, and now he's pulling a whole cut of transfer cars from the Milwaukee to the Burlington Northern over into the Stacy Street yard. And the yardmasters told him to go ahead and drop those cars, and as you'll see in a minute, he'll run around the cars with his light engine and return empty back to Argo where he came from.
We're running a more modern trim and we're putting on top of it. I don't blame him. It's his layout.
And we had a little bit of a dirty track issue there, but he overcame it, although we seem to have lost the engine noise. Anyway, you've heard me talk about reality model railroading. Well, here's a great example. He just uncoupled the engine and intended to pull off to the right. I'll let him talk you through what he does next.
That was not the way I want it to go. Well, since I'm there, this is what I'm going to do. Let him come out. Go back to Argo, if I may. There we go.
It's not easy to run two switch engines at the same time, so he's just going to park this BN engine for the moment and let the Milwaukee switcher go back to Argo. Keep an eye on him though, he might still run both of these engines at the same time. Looks like I knocked off that C&H sugar tank again, but it's probably better to have it loose so the elbow knocks it over rather than banging onto it and breaking something. You can see he's got the BN switcher out at the same time as the Milwaukee switcher is going back to Argo. I'm not sure why, but we can follow along. I never mind looking at a GP9, do you? Especially when it honks. Very nice. Well, back in Argo, looks like he's going to try to tie down on top of those cars there. Squeak! Yeah, he just turned off the headlights in the switcher and is now turning off the ProtoThrottle. Very good. More on that later.
Here we go, Interbay.
Well, back in Stacy Street Yard, Scott has put together a transfer run between Stacy Street and Interbay Yard from South Seattle to North Seattle, with some of the same cars that he received in interchange from the Milwaukee. You might recognize some of them, especially those first few cars. And so now he's heading towards the tunnel which goes underneath downtown Seattle. And in a few minutes he'll come out on the other side and go into Interbay Yard. We have long debates here about whether or not a caboose is required on a transfer between these two yards that are both in the same city. There's no definitive answer, but since we all enjoy cabooses, what we end up doing is deciding that cabooses are required, whether that's realistic or not. Another great example of reality model railroading.
Still have a lumber car sitting there and he's going to put away.
Well, there's downtown Seattle in the background, and our train is coming into the Interbay, or otherwise known as Balmer Yard. Scott forgot to line a switch, so he didn't go into the yard track he intended.
It's not where I wanted to go. How did that happen?
Well, we don't like backing up trains as a general rule, but this one is fairly short, so I guess the risks are low.
And my assumption was that was just the level of, road
In general, this Ather Genesis Jeep 9 looks and runs great, but it's one of the earlier models with incandescent light bulbs. So the front headlight burned out. We'll have to replace that with an LED one of these days. Another example of reality model railroading.
No headlight?
Yeah, it's not on. The rotating beacon is.
You notice that buckled walkway in the first car behind the engine? That's something you often see with model freight cars. They're made of metal, and then there's a differential thermal expansion that takes place. So you often have to cut them apart and glue them back down so they lay flat. If I ever get around to it, I'll do a little video showing you how I do that. I don't know about you, but I do find it hard to get used to watching GP9s in action. This has been fun. All right, now stay tuned for the next example of fun. What an obnoxious bell. This is 3 Milwaukee SDL39s pulling out a Bayside yard. We wanted something useful for them to do, so we decided to hitch them up to the jet job cars in the background there and pretend they were going over to the Boeing plant in Mukilteo.
Are you going to need a ride, Aiden?
My dad should be picking me up.
Somebody was backing up over on the opposite side of the aisle. So I honked back at them just for fun. Bang! You know how I feel about bangs. Ooh, that's painful. Charlie turned on the vacuum cleaner again, so I had to suppress the engine noise for a couple minutes here. It was worth it though, as you'll see in a minute. These are some beautiful engines. As I understand it, they only made it out to the Seattle area once in 1979, but on this railroad, 3 of them made it out in 1973. And if you need any proof, here it is. There's quite a brace of locomotives there, turntable. You might notice there are 2 Great Northern E units, which were just removed in the previous video, part 53. Well, that brings us to the construction update portion of this video. Robin Peel has been working on these 3 bridges. which will be permanently installed in a couple of weeks. And Charlie Conway has been tearing up all of my previously made scenery, and you can see in the tan sections he's putting in Sculptamold. Here I have some video of him installing the Sculptamold, where those bridges will go, and Robin is still putting the final touches on the bridges. More on that later.
It's like it gives me the excuse to run a nice long turn. And that's
Yeah, really nice.
Yeah, I think it's going to come together.
Charlie is a multi-talented individual. Not only is he making this scenery, but he's also the person who shot those prototype videos that were featured earlier in this video.
With Robin, sort of coordinating these.
If it weren't for him, we wouldn't have dragged out all our modern era equipment.
Yeah, that really,
Not just a one-man show.
Well, with that little construction update interlude, we go off into the sunset with the Milwaukee SDL39s hauling the jet job cars off south of Everett. And you can see that nice rotating beacon in the front unit. And you can contemplate what the next fun video we'll produce will be. I think it's going to be some more Milwaukee switching down in Lego Town, which is pretty cool. So this has been quite a video today. We had some Milwaukee switching in Argo, a Burlington Northern transfer between Stacy Street and Balmer Yards, a little fooling around with the Milwaukee SDL39s, and most unusually, a prototype locomotive all in BN green from the present day, which we copied with our own HO scale version. So for now, this is Burr Stewart wishing you much fun with trains. Goodbye.